welcome to another episode of What Are You Selling with me, David Green. And joining me today is the author of The Lazarus Taxa, Lindsey Kinsella. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very good. Thank you for having me.
No problem. Oh, I think you're the first Scottish person that we've had on the show so far.
Apologies if no one can understand me, because it's a common problem.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I actually know a lot of Scottish authors, particularly fantasy authors, but none of them have been on the here yet, right? So I don't know why. So there'll be some people there who can understand you, which is a bonus. But for those who can't, just buy his book. That's all we need to tell you.
I won't be offended if you put up subtitles. That's okay.
I think YouTube started doing that anyway recently. I've noticed that if you're watching something at a low volume, it just puts the subtitles automatically. But sometimes they're wildly inaccurate.
It could be worse.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So thanks for coming on to the show. And for people that are listening on Spotify Music or Spotify or Apple Music or watching on YouTube, and it's your first time that you've been on the channel, please do subscribe to us and check out the other things we have on the channel as well. We have other interviews with authors, we have live readings, and we also have the Wheel of Time show, Easing the Reader, as well. So do check those out. But Lindsey, I wanted to ask you, The Lazarus Taxa is your first book. It's on Amazon, and it's on Amazon at the moment. It came out in January this year. Had you always wanted to become a writer? Has that always been a dream for you, or is it something that you've kind of just stumbled into somewhere along the way?
I think it was always something that was in the background. It was always something that I had considered, but I think it took kind of COVID lockdown really to kind of push me over the edge and convince me that I should do it. I was in a position where I was like, there was nothing to lose and there was nothing else to do. So I thought I would give it a bash, and it seems to have worked out quite well. So I think it's something that I put off for a long time because it seemed unrealistic. But yeah, I'm glad I took the plunge.
You started writing during the pandemic, or had you been kind of writing a little bit before that?
No, I pretty much started writing during the pandemic. I mean, I think the last time I wrote anything before that was maybe 10 years ago, something like that. And it was, very informally. So, yeah, this was the first time I kind of wrote in anger, if you like.
And The Lazarus Taxa is sci-fi, a little bit of fantasy in there as well, but mainly sci-fi. Is that what you're into? Is it something that you would read as in your spare time?
It is, yeah. I think sci-fi, fantasy, that tends to be the genres that I would read. And I think just naturally that's the easiest genres to write if it's something that is already entertaining to you. But yeah, I mean, I think for me, I'd tend to write a book that I would like to read. I don't know, that's probably common, but that was certainly what I went for.
Yeah, it is common, but also not as common as you think. So, because some people just, I do a little bit of ghostwriting, and it's stuff that I generally wouldn't read most of the time. All right, if I had to, but it's just like, it's like, can you write this? It's like, yeah, I can do it, I suppose. And then you do it, and so yeah, it's kind of weird, really, when you think about it. But I suppose it's like anything. It's like a job when you get into it, when you start doing it full time. Is that what you would like to do with your writing? Not do ghostwriting, but would you like to turn this into like a full-time kind of career?
It would be nice. I mean, on the one hand, I do already have a career, which I don't see me throwing away anytime soon. So I think it would be more of a kind of professional part-time career. But yeah, it would be nice to sit down and just write for a living.
Yeah.
But I think most authors will tell you that probably won't pay the bills. But it would be great fun if I could.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a very competitive market, and obviously Amazon do like to take a huge chunk of anything that is made, which
Oh
is
yes.
yes, they do. So, how did you get into? Were you a big reader from an early age, and was it always like sci-fi and fantasy that you were into?
Pretty much, yeah. Also, a little. Actually, when I was younger, it was horror. I loved to read a
Yeah.
little bit of horror when I was younger. Um, and I think that's something which I would like to write in future. And I think there are aspects of that in my current writing, but um, yeah, it's funny. As much as I fell away from writing for a long time, I actually fell away from reading for a long time as well. And I think again, as you know, for all that COVID had a lot of negative effects. It did have the bonus of slowing life down a little,
Yeah.
and suddenly I had more time for both reading and writing, and that probably spurred things on as well. Just being able to read again and getting that inspiration from doing so.
Yeah. And it's interesting about horror there because obviously horror does bleed over quite easily into sci-fi, um, which sci-fi is a good genre of that anyway. You can go in a few different kinds of directions with it. With the Lazarus taxa, how would you describe that to people that are listening and watching?
Oh, I would probably describe it as kind of grounded sci-fi. So it's not kind of some sort of kind of wild space epic. It's quite grounded in reality, so much as science fiction can be. It's quite tense, and I would say that it almost takes on aspects of horror in places. Um, it's kind of almost a thriller in that sense. Um, so yeah, it's not full sci-fi, but it is quite heavy on the science as well.
It's time travel as well. So how did you approach that and keeping it grounded as well?
I think the one hole that I very much wanted to avoid falling into was for the time travel to be too tempting as a plot device. I wanted to make sure that it was quite limited in its capability, and I went about that in such a way that time travel as a new technology, as in the book, it's not something that could just be used willy nilly. It was something that, I mean, in the book, it takes 6 months between time jumps for the next one to arrive. I made the point that there are new timelines when someone time travels, so going back in time to change your own actions isn't something that would ever work in that situation. So I wanted to remove time travel as a kind of mechanism by which to change the plot.
Yeah.
So it's deliberately quite limiting in terms of how it's used, which I think stems from the fact that usually I find time travel in fiction can often be quite lazy. It's too easy to just use it as, we'll just go back in time and change it. So I very much wanted to avoid that.
It always reminds me of the conversation in Avengers Endgame where they're on about Back to the Future and they're like, "What? So Back to the Future was garbage?" And they're like, "Well, yeah."
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a difficult one. I think that it can become very complicated when you begin to write time travel. It can be very easy to write yourself into plot holes. Um, and I wanted to be very careful of that. I wanted it to be a very subtle form of time travel. So in effect, how it works in the story is that once you have made a journey through time, you're effectively stuck there for an extended period of time. So there's that kind of sense of isolation. It's not just a piece of transportation that can be used whenever you want. Um, it's a bit more restrictive than that.
And that's the thing with sci-fi. Like you have to, and even fantasy as well. You have when you're creating like a magic system or a new type of technology, you have to make certain rules to make it believable, but then you have to stick by those rules as well, which obviously is a bit more of a cheat in fantasy, because then you can bring someone in who's a bit more powerful that the rules don't apply to them, which a lot of writers do when they kind of find themselves a little bit restricted. But in sci-fi, it's like, this is a hard and fast rule and it can't be broken.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think it's important to set those rules, because I think the way I've always seen it with science fiction is that you're allowed one removal from reality, and that can be a broad reaching removal. You know, that can be, it's 1,000 years in the future, in which case it's one removal, but you can do a lot with that. In my instance, it's, you know, there is a new invention of time travel. So everything else within that has to be within the bounds of reality, or it just doesn't become believable anymore. So yeah, it's difficult to not branch out too much and throw anything extra into the mix, or it does just become a bit of a mess.
Yeah, sure. It's always usually used in two ways when you get to time travel stories. It's either people are able to go back and change things, and then just have no kind of repercussions to that, or the things they're going back to change are things that already always were meant to happen. But that also brings up its own paradoxes of like, well, Lost, for example, was one of those ones where it's like, we were all meant to go back in the past, and we're the ones that caused these things in the first place, that brought us to the place we were at. But then we had to go there to do it in the first place. So, it gets that kind of convoluted. I do like this one where it's like, if you go into the past, it just creates a new timeline. It's just not as messy.
Yeah, I did want to avoid both of those things. I mean, I think for me, really, I wanted to write a story that was set in a certain period of Earth's history, and you know, time travel was the only kind of logical way to do that. But I wanted to do that without creating those typical time travel tropes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So where did you get the idea for the Lazarus taxa from?
I think it stemmed from a few things. I think primarily, I mean, I've always been somewhat of a kind of paleontology dinosaur geek. And I think some of it stemmed from somewhat of a frustration at how little it's represented in common media, or I think more commonly how poorly it's represented. And in terms of science fiction, it tends to be an area of science fiction where the science part of it is kind of ignored. So yeah, I think it's something I always felt was fascinating, and I wanted to kind of, you know, share that with others. It seems to be a kind of forgotten science in a lot of ways. So yeah, I wanted to bring some of that from the background and let people see some really interesting stuff.
Yeah. So did you have you had the theme, I guess, before you had the story idea, or did they kind of come up at the same time?
I would say I had the theme down first. The story the story changed quite a number of times throughout writing it. Yeah, it was an interesting one. I think part of that was because it was my first novel, and I think I had too many ideas, and I tried to do them all at once. And yeah, I very much had to go back and rewrite large chunks of the story. I'm glad that I did. I'm glad I took the time on it. It took me about 2 years in the end to write the book. Obviously, I have other works in progress, which I expect to take me considerably shorter amounts of time. So yeah, I think it took me a while to settle into a kind of writing process and really decide on a story. The last, you know, the kind of third act, the last act in particular, I think I must have rewrote that whole part of the book 3 or 4 times. Right. But yeah, I got there, and as it turns out, kind of in the end, although the theme and the subject material was what I decided on first, I think with the end product, I think the story that took so long to concoct, I actually think is now strongest aspects of the book, and it's now what I'm most proud of, really. So yeah, it was worth taking the time on, but it was certainly not quite an afterthought, but it was secondary to the process.
Yeah, we surprised how often these things are, and a lot of times people will find the story by just writing it and just writing these things and looking for that through line. Or when they've actually finished what they think is the first draft, and they go and they start reading it back, they go, you know what, I need to put something in this to run through the entire story, otherwise it's just a series of scenes. But that's fine. That's how writing works sometimes.
Yeah. Oh no, yeah, definitely. I think there were times when I thought, you know, I had some really great ideas to throw into the book, and realised that in the context of the current draft that it was at, that it made no sense, and I had to, you know, rewrite big chunks of the rest of the book to work that in. But yeah, I think that's just part of the process sometimes.
Yeah, sure. So what is the plan next? Is this the first in a series?
Yeah, I certainly have plans for subsequent books in that series. I have quite a lot of kind of interesting ideas from where to take the basic concept, and what other areas you could explore with that. That being said, I think that might be a couple of years down the line. I have some other concepts which I would like to explore first. So I'd like to branch into fantasy a little. I have a couple of, my current working project is broadly fantasy. Again, it's a fairly grounded, but I would call it fantasy. And I have some more kind of experimental fantasy ideas floating around. So I would like to explore those before returning to the Lazarus Taxa world.
Sounds good. Well, best of luck with the rest of your writing, and thanks for coming on to the show to talk to us about Lazarus Taxa. Where can people that are listening and watching find all your work on the internet and keep up to date with all your projects?
So I mostly keep in touch with people through Facebook. So I have a social media page. It's just Lindsey Kinsella and the Lazarus Taxa. Keep up with everything that we've got on there. I have a group on Facebook too called Lindsey Kinsella's Chrononauts. And yeah, you can find the book on Amazon and Google Play.
So everyone who's watching on YouTube, listening on Spotify and Apple Music, all those links will be in the show notes below. So please do check those out. Check out Lindsey's book, and also say hello to him on the Facebook groups and everything like that as well. So Lindsey, thanks again for coming on, and you'll have to come on later on in the year or next year, maybe when you've finalised your next project, and you can talk to us about that.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much for having me.
No worries at all. And everyone's still watching until the end. Thanks very much. Until next time.